Hello and welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski. I am the community coordinator, and I will also be your host today. So before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Stewardship Network. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based TSN member communities across the Great Lakes with emerging presences across the country. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission: we exist to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about each of those aspects of our work now. So we connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for TSN member communities, and we share it as widely as possible. Equip, we remove hurdles for TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And mobilize, through our TSN member communities, we make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. And we could not do that without the wonderful work of all of our member communities. We are very grateful for all of them. So let's dig a little bit deeper here. In terms of Connect, one of our favorite aspects of the connections that we make with the Stewardship Network is our annual conference. So this coming January 23rd and 24th of 2025, so 23rd, 24, 25, easy way to remember that, we will be convening at the Kellogg Center in East Lansing, Michigan for another year of the conference. And we are so grateful to have the conference back in person. It is absolutely a highlight of our year. So I would like to give you a little overview of what you can expect at the conference. And again, if you want to go to stewardshipnetwork.org/conference, you can feel free to learn more, and all of this information is on there. So as I said, January 23rd and 24th of 2025 in person, it will be at the Kellogg Center in East Lansing, Michigan. And our motto is learn, connect, and replenish. And we really do try to embody all three aspects of that phrase because we want you to learn. We work really hard to have a quality representation of presenters at the conference, presenting on topics that are really important for folks in our field to know. Of course, the connections that you make between fellow attendees, between these presenters, it's an opportunity to network so thoroughly with people in the field. It is really a remarkable opportunity to meet people or to reconnect with folks that you have known for a long time that maybe you only see a few times a year. And replenish. I will speak for myself, but I'm sure a lot of others feel the same way, that you leave the conference feeling energized by spending time with folks that are so passionate and knowledgeable about stewardship. It really is an inspiring event, and you end up starting your year off on a good foot by attending the conference. So we hope that you will join us. Again, stewardshipnetwork.org/conference, and we'd love for you to explore the new website. We spent a lot of time putting it together, and it is pretty remarkable. So the full agenda is now online. You can peruse all of the sessions and kind of make your schedule if you'd like. We have over 80 excellent speakers, from seasoned leaders to emerging voices, and we try our best to make host a variety of presenters and topics. So we hope that you will explore all of the different sessions that we have to offer. And we're very excited to announce that we have MDARD credits available this year. Some of you will remember that in past conferences we have offered MDARD continuing education credits, and we will be doing so again this year. So we have 13 different seminars that are approved for credits, and some of these sessions are concurrent, but as an individual, you can earn up to 7 credits by attending all of the different sessions that are available to you. So again, 13 seminars are approved for recertification credits, and an individual could earn up to 7 by attending as many as are available to you. So we hope that you will take advantage of that opportunity. Now on to Equip. I'm very excited to talk about some of the amazing things that have happened this year at the Stewardship Network. So taken together, programs like the TSN webcast that you're at today, our Gloves for Good program, the Spring Challenge, our events calendar, our job board, we have reached stewards across 36 US states and 2 Canadian provinces in 2024. That is absolutely remarkable. And we are so excited that the reach of our programs can expand so far beyond the direct service area of our member communities. Our member community program continues to grow, but even beyond those member communities, we have a lot of different programs that touch a lot of people across the US and beyond. And if you'd like to learn more about some of our 2024 highlights, I recommend that you go to stewardshipnetwork.org/impact. And you can learn more about all of these different highlights we have from this year. So getting into some of those, our Gloves for Good program has now delivered more than 37,000 pairs of lightly used work gloves to nature's caretakers, saving recipient organizations over $56,000. So if you'd like to learn more about the Gloves for Good program, check that out on our website. You can get lightly used gloves for only the cost of shipping, or you can come for local pickup at our Ann Arbor office. And we are so proud to have diverted a lot of waste from landfills and saved organizations a bunch of money in the process. So, in partnership with the California Natural Resources Agency and the Resources Legacy Fund, the Stewardship Network was proud to help 70 Indigenous leaders, tribal members, and representatives from under-resourced organizations attend state-level stewardship meetings in California. That is an incredible opportunity to make sure that these meetings are accessible to all types of folks. And we're very proud to have worked with the California Natural Resources Agency and the Resources Legacy Fund to make that happen. Thank you so much for your partnership and for the work that you do on the ground. Lastly, we got to talk about Mobilize. So our Spring Challenge program this year had an incredible impact with over 13,000 participants nationwide and more than 58,000 hours of diverse stewardship activities reported. You may remember that we have all kinds of different categories with the Spring Challenge. Used to be the Garlic Mustard Challenge, then it was the Spring Invasive Species Challenge. Now we're doing, beach cleanups, we're doing prescribed burns, we're doing herbicide treatments, all kinds of things. But that impact is really remarkable. And that all happens because of the on the ground work of our partner organizations and our member communities. Once again, you can learn more about some of that impact at stewardshipnetwork.org/impact. But some examples of that. So we worked with our partners this spring to deliver 50,000 free hazelnut seedlings to sequester carbon, filter nutrients, and provide food across Michigan and Ohio. Really remarkable initiative there, and we could not have done it without the on-the-ground partners that helped us establish partnerships to distribute those free hazelnut seedlings. TSN member communities had a remarkable local impact in the management of invasive species, including the BCK SISMA's work to survey over 10,000 acres for mile-a-minute weed, the Lake St. Clair SISMA's vigilance against European frogbit and water primrose, and the Cake SISMA's perennial efforts against garlic mustard. So we're so proud of our member communities and all of the on-the-ground impact that they do. And we want you to learn more about all of the impacts that the Stewardship Network has been able to have this year by going to stewardshipnetwork.org/impact. And it goes without saying, but I must say it, that you all make all of this possible. As a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our network to make all of this work possible. So we accept donations, financial contributions from individuals and organizations. We also accept endowment contributions, and we also have planned giving options for you. So I'm now doing the thing of asking you to please, if you are in a financial situation to do so, we really encourage you to visit stewardshipnetwork.org/support as we continue on our fall fundraising drive. And please consider making a contribution to the Stewardship Network today, because your support is what makes it possible for us to have such a wide-ranging impact with all of our programs. And without your support, it simply would not be possible. So thank you very much to everybody that has already contributed. Thank you to folks who plan on, after this webcast, taking a minute to reach into your pockets and help us out. And if you're not in a financial position to support us, you are still supporting us by being here today, watching the webcast, working with us, supporting any of our programs, visiting the event calendar, all of the above. So we appreciate any version of support that you can provide. But again, if you are in a financial position to do so, visit stewardshipnetwork.org/support. We would really, really appreciate it. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. So we have Scott Tiegs from Oakland University. And the subject today is jumping worms in Michigan, impacts, identification, and prevention. So Scott, I would love for you to take it away from there.
Yeah, Rob, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here.
Great.
And let's make sure this works. Rob, what do you
Yep,
see?
I am seeing it. Looks great. All right, take it
Nothing, no
away.
slide. Well, thank you again so much for the introduction. It's been a chance to learn a little bit more about your organization and all the amazing talks that you've had this year. So thank you for inviting me to share this, what I think is an important topic with you, that of exotic invasive earthworms. I do want to acknowledge that I realize it's a bit ridiculous that earthworms are something that we should be worried about. I mean, what could be, more harmless? I'm sure many of you were, like myself, grew up as a kid in the Midwest, capturing earthworms, catching them in the backyard growing up. And we have this impression that they are, we've been taught they're good for the soil, they're beneficial components of our gardens. And, they're indicators of healthy ecosystems. But a lot of those things that we've been taught about earthworms, especially exotic invasive earthworms, are dangerously untrue. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, in particular, jumping worms, but all exotic invasive earthworms in the Midwest region. We'll learn about their ecological impacts. We'll learn how to identify them, and we'll learn about how to prevent their spread a little bit. So again, thank you for the introduction, and let's get started. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist, and so I'm interested in processes like ecosystem respiration, organic matter decomposition, CO2 fixation, and the recycling of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, nutrients that are often in limited supply. They're in short supply, but they're needed for essential biological machinery, and processes as diverse as protein synthesis, photosynthesis, and respiration. This sort of figure that's shown here can be found in most introductory high school biology or introductory ecology textbooks. It's a box and arrows diagram of nutrient cycling, in this case, nitrogen. It's a conceptual model. It's intentionally designed to be an oversimplification to help us get our heads around really complex phenomena. Sort of wrong on purpose in order to be useful. And again, these can be found in any textbooks, and so I get that they're designed to be oversimplifications, but they do foster the perspective that's not entirely incorrect. They foster the perspective that the Earth's ecosystems are run entirely by microbes and plants. Rarely in these sort of box and arrows diagrams is there any sort of depiction of animals. Right? They seem to be lacking from this perspective, but that's one thing I want to help undo today, dispel a bit, is this idea that the world's ecosystems are run only by microbes and plants, because animals are important for ecosystems as well. That's something that we're going to be talking about today a little bit, specifically earthworms. Earthworms are ecosystem engineers. So that's a term you might have heard of. Let's formalize our relationship with that term a little bit and define it. Ecosystem engineers are organisms that directly or indirectly modulate the availability of resources for other species by causing physical state changes in biotic or abiotic environments. Some classic examples are beavers, right? They make ponds, donkeys and burrows around the world, especially in arid and semi-arid regions, are really important for making wallows. These expose fresh water in places that it's pretty rare. Termites are important ecosystem engineers, and rainforests, tent-making bats can be important. And in our temperate deciduous forests of the upper Midwest, exotic invasive earthworms are important ecosystem engineers as well. So we're going to talk about some ways that they influence ecosystems. They physically modify soil habitats, they influence resource availability, and they have landscape scale impacts. Well, in order to really understand earthworms and the earthworm invasion in the United States and in North America in general, you really have to go back about 15,000 years ago to the end of the Pleistocene. So here's a picture, a map of North America, Canada, the United States, and this blue area to the north, that's all ice. This is 15,000 years ago, and this is what our continent looked like. Where we're at here in Southeast Michigan, at least, let's see, this is me down here. Down here in Southeast Michigan, as you can see from the laser pointer here, this was all under, a mile thick continental ice sheet. Pretty terrible habitat to be a soft-bodied invertebrate like an earthworm. So this left this entire region, this vast expanse of North America, without any native earthworms. All of our deciduous forests in the Midwest and elsewhere have evolved in the absence of earthworms. So this might surprise you. Again, you grew up catching these creatures. Earthworms are good for the soil. They're harmless. They're in our backyards. They're fun to catch. But keep in mind that every single one of those that you ever caught growing up as a kid was an exotic invasive earthworm, probably from Europe. Which begs the question, how did they get here? Well, there's a few different modes of introduction. When European colonists first came to the region, they brought a lot of soil with them from the old world, soil as ballast on their ships. And when they would get to North America, they would make cargo space on those ships available by simply dumping that soil overboard. So that's how we got our first exotic earthworms. They've probably been here for many hundred years with the first European explorers, first European settlists, rather. So they brought soil over, and that, of course, contained all these European species. They also brought plants that, of course, were rooted in soil. Fishing now is an important mechanism via which these exotic invasive earthworms can move around the landscape. I challenge you to go to a rural area in the upper Midwest in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan in the summertime. Go to a corner store, and I challenge you to find one that doesn't sell earthworms. All those species that are for sale, almost all of them are European species. And so now what happens is they get along or get around the landscape by fishermen, by anglers who use them as bait. Of course, you can get online and buy earthworms for the vermicomposting industry, for composting at home. And they also get around via the other human activities, such as logging. If they get into rivers, they can be transported downstream very readily. And any other forest disturbances, anything that moves around soil is probably going to have a good chance of moving earthworms around with it. And part of the reason is not only do we move earthworms around themselves, but we also move around their propagules. So this teeny little structure right here to the right, some people call these earthworm eggs. That's not correct. It's more like a cocoon. But as you can see here next to the penny, they're incredibly tiny. So all it takes is one of these guys to get transported into an area that's without earthworms, and they can be introduced there. Well, let's talk about exotic European earthworms first, because most of what we know about the impacts of exotic invasive earthworms in North America come from studies of European species. Most of what we know about earthworms comes from studies of European species. And so here on the left-hand side, we have a cross-section of the soil from the upper Midwest. This is what our nice native soils look like. They're very, very springy. They have an almost, like a mattress-like texture. If you walk across a forest that doesn't have earthworm invasions in it, it feels really, really springy. That's because of all this organic matter that you can see here. It makes what's called a duff layer. This is partially decomposed organic matter. It has lots of interstices in it. It's very, very porous. It's airy. It's light. These are what our soils look like. It's also really important habitat for a lot of other different types of invertebrates, insects, mites, all sorts of roly-polies, springtails, etc. Really nice habitat. And this is what happens to our soils in the presence of exotic invasive earthworms. Those earthworms feed on that partially decomposed organic matter, and they excrete it. They poop it out as earthworm castings, which have very physical and chemical properties relative to our nice springy duff layers that we have in our native soils. In contrast, in soils where there has been an exotic invasive earthworm invasion, such as these soils shown here, you can see it's been converted from the springy duff layer to something that's very, very dense. It's almost greasy, doesn't have these interstices, it doesn't have this porous habitat. And as a result of that, it has very different invertebrate communities that reside. So what are some other impacts of invasive earthworms? Well, they alter soil structure and nutrient profiles. They alter soil microbe communities, especially fungi, because fungi have this, this very well-developed network throughout that soil matrix. Anything that physically disturbs that network is going to be impacted by earthworms. So earthworms really impact fungi in our soils, typically reducing fungal diversity. They can reduce seed germination of native species and facilitate the germination of seeds from invasive plants. It's been shown that in areas that have been invaded by European species and jumping worms, that garlic mustard germination rates for garlic mustard seeds are increased. Ditto for buckthorn as well. And then lastly, when we have earthworm invasions in riparian zones, they consume all that duff layer, all that organic matter that I showed you before, and they mineralize. They convert it from an organic form to a mineral form that's a lot more soluble. And as a result of that, the nutrients that are contained in that soil can be readily transferred to streams and rivers. And so what's going on in terms of our Great Lakes, in terms of nutrient loading, to a degree has to do with our earthworm invasion here when they convert organic forms of nitrogen and phosphorus into forms like nitrate and phosphorus, and phosphate rather, which again are super soluble and can make their ways into our streams and rivers. European earthworms affect our forest vegetation. So here on the left-hand side, we have a nice temperate deciduous forest from the upper Midwest. Notice the nice lower canopy layers here. We have lots of diversity, multiple stages of forest height, lots of different canopy statures in terms of height, lots of vegetation on the forest floor. This is what our forests have historically looked like. But in the presence of exotic invasive earthworms, a lot of those species get lost. The seeds don't germinate nearly as well in that really greasy, dense soil that I showed you a photograph ago. And through that mechanism, earthworms can impact the structure of our forest communities, including economically important species that we care about. For example, sugar maple seeds don't do very well. Seeds don't germinate very well in soil that's been altered by exotic invasive earthworms. Well, I want to introduce a little bit of ecology here about earthworms and introduce this idea that earthworms have niches. So in order to do that, first I want to go back, I don't know, 60, 70 years to a really famous ecologist named Robert MacArthur. And he studied the ecology of these 5 species of warblers in spruce forests in North America. So here's 5 different species. If you're a bird, you probably are from yellow-rumped warbler, blackburnian warbler, Cape May warbler, etc. And at the time, a predominant ecological theory was called the theory of competitive exclusion. And it stated that if 2 species have really similar niches, if they eat the same thing, they live in the same place, etc., one of them is just going to be a little bit better at their job than the other, and it's going to outcompete the other species, resulting in competitive exclusion. So if that's the predominant theory, how come we live in this world that has 10,000 different bird species, lots and lots of different warbler species? So to understand that theory of competitive exclusion and why it doesn't seem to happen in some instances, he studied these warblers that are shown here. And again, as you can see from these tree maps, it shows where they tend to occupy that tree as habitat. So for example, in the Cape May warbler here, you can see it occupies the upper part of that tree. Whereas the yellow-rumped warbler, this is part of the reason we see them so much when they migrate through in the summer and fall, is that they tend to occupy the lower branches of the tree. So they're easy for us to see down here at the bottom. So because these warblers occupy different parts of the tree, they partition that niche. They have different niches and they don't competitively exclude each other. And that idea extends to earthworms as well, because earthworms have different niches. They have 3 predominant niches. We're going to call these epigeic. These are species that live in the upper litter layer. They tend to be pigmented. They don't make burrows, and they tend to be small in size. Then we have endogeic species. These are soil feeders. They tend to not have skin pigmentation because, well, they're buried much of the time, and so they don't really need that dark pigmentation for camouflage. And they tend to create a network of both horizontal and branching burrows, and they tend to be small to medium size. And then we have invasive species. That's these over here. They tend to feed on fresh leaf litter. They're soil dwellers. They have pigmented skin because they come out of their burrow quite a bit to feed. And they tend to dig these deep, vertical, unbranching burrows. Night crawlers are a species of exotic earthworm that you're probably familiar with. And they're a good example of these invasive species. Well, one of the reasons we should care about the addition of new earthworm species like these jumping worms, because typically ecological impacts from invasive species increase as we increase the number of invasive species. Exactly how that happens, whether it's a linear relationship shown here with A, or kind of a curvilinear response like B, where it approaches an asymptote, or C, isn't really well known for a lot of different taxonomic groups. But it's important to keep in mind that as we add species, we tend to see these increases in ecological impacts. And so in recent decades, when we've experienced this invasion of these jumping worms, which tend to belong to 2 different genera, 2 different genuses, it's called genera, which are Amynthus and Metaphira. These are just called jumping worms, or in many instances, Asian jumping worms. You might see them on the internet called crazy worms, Alabama jumping worms, snake worms. Usually they're just called jumping worms, or very often Amynthus, because that's the most common genus in North America. We have a lot of different species of these. Most of them tend to be epigeic or epiendogeic species, and they tend to be native to Eastern Asia. And here's a few species that are common to the West: Amynthus agrestis, Amynthus tokyoensis, and Metaphira hilgendorfi. This was recently changed from Amynthus. And this was one of the first species that was found in the state of Michigan, for example. And some traits about these species: they can be characterized as having high growth rates, really, really high densities, and pretty flexible diet. This is a trait that has led to their invasion success. And they also have a parthenogenic life cycle. That means they can reproduce asexually. So all it takes, in theory, is one individual to start a new population. And that's really a challenging part of their management, as it takes just, again, one individual to potentially start a whole population of invasive jumping worms. Here's what their cocoons look like. The take-home message of the slide is, well, these cocoons are impossibly tiny, right? They're just a few millimeters across. They're very dark in coloration. You could hold these, in your hand with a soil mixture, and you probably would have, a hard time knowing if they were in there or not. They're difficult to detect. And these cocoons are pretty drought and cold resistant. They can almost freeze and remain viable, and they can almost entirely dry out and remain viable. So this is an important aspect of their life cycle that gets them around the landscape and contributes to their spread around the upper Midwest. Another unique trait that they have is that they can go from cocoon to a sexually mature adult in a single growing season. This is a contrast to a lot of our European species that are perennial. It takes them 3, 4, 5 years to reach sexual maturity. But in the case of jumping worms, they can go from a cocoon, like I showed you before, to a really big, fat, healthy individual in the span of just a few months. So on the left-hand side, I should have put something for scale bar in here, but here's what they look like in the early spring. This is probably maybe a half a centimeter long, something like that, just about this big, really, really tiny. And by the time you get to, the dog days of summer, late July, early August, these things are pretty big. They're maybe on the order of 10 or 15 centimeters in length, and they grow really, really quickly. That's what's plotted here on this scatter plot to the right. On the x-axis, we have time and days. On the y-axis, we just have earthworm mass. And as you can see, they can go from just a few milligrams in early spring to over 200 milligrams by late summer. So they grow really, really quickly. And this is a different facet of their ecology from most of what we know about European earthworms. And it means that the ecological impacts that they have are going to be very abrupt and very intense. These jumping worms significantly alter soil structure. You can tell if you have these on your property by looking and finding soil that looks like this. It's really granulated. The castings are very well defined. They're a little bit harder. I can look in my garden in late summer and find these and know that I have jumping worms. They're pretty easy to detect later in the summer when the soil starts to look like this and when earthworms are big and they're abundant. So I've got a video here. I'm going to try to get a wee bit. This is going to work. If it doesn't, that's not a big deal either. Oh, it's not going to cooperate, is it? I'm not going to give up just yet. Just give me a second. I'm going to try one more trick here. Get rid of this. There, I did it. Okay, so we have substantial biomass of earthworms on our property. I live in Lake Orion, Michigan, north of Detroit, about 45 minutes or so. Me and my little kid, he was 2 at the time, we went and searched for jumping worms in the backyard. And in about 20 minutes, we found this many. So I show this for 2 reasons. First, to give you an idea of how incredibly abundant these earthworms can be, right? This is probably the biggest biomass of any invertebrate during this time of the year. So that's the first thing, they're super abundant. And again, the more abundant they are, the more ecological impacts they're going to have. But secondly, is I wanted you to see this thrashing behavior that they have, because it's really characteristic of these jumping worms. When we first dumped them on this tray, let's do that again. You can see them really jump and thrash about. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. If you see a worm jumping like that, not a European species, it is a jumping worm. Okay. Let's see if we can get out of here. Well, how do the impacts of jumping worms compared to European species? We know a lot about European species, certainly relative to jumping worms. And a lot of the impacts are very, very similar. They tend to be similar, but faster, and I would say more intense, more severe, more acute. That litter layer and that duff layer that I showed you before, it's quickly consumed, and this mineralizes the nutrients contained within, both the carbon and the nitrogen. So that nitrogen can make its way into our water bodies where we don't want it, and that carbon gets respired back to the atmosphere where we don't. Talk about that a bit. They often outcompete European species. They mature twice as fast, they reproduce more quickly, and they tend to have greater densities in some instances. So they might be outcompeting some of our European species in some contexts. Well, how do you identify them? This is a common question that people have. I wouldn't say it's terribly difficult once you know a few things about them. So first of all, let me get the laser pointer going here real quick. There we go. The reproductive parts of the earthworm, this is it right here. This is called the clitellum. This is what they look like on jumping worms, and this is what the clitellum looks like on these European species. So in the case of the jumping worms, they have a very smooth, light-colored clitellum, and it tends to be a little bit hourglass shaped. If you look closely, you can see here on the clitellum, it's just a little bit hourglass shaped, in contrast to European species where the clitellum is kind of swollen. It's usually among the fatter parts of the earth. So that's a quick and easy way to tell is the presence of this hour-shaped clitellum that tends to be smooth and lighter in color. Also, the earthworms, and you can see it here in this photo a little bit, they tend to be a little bit iridescent. They've got kind of a sheen to them, almost purple and green. The light catches it just so, and you can really see this iridescent purple that they have. And this is consistent across the entire body of the earthworms. And probably most distinctively, as we saw in the video a moment ago, they have this behavior where they thrash. They have this serpentine locomotion where they move like a snake. In contrast to earthworms from Europe, they tend to inch forward and pull the rest of their bodies behind them. So those are some ways that you can identify these jumping worms to see if you have them in a property that you care about, etc. When you identify juveniles, it's still possible. It's a little more challenging because they're not sexually mature. They don't have a clitellum yet. And they can look like some European species. They still have this thrashing behavior, and they still have that sheen. And something I didn't mention before is that they have this phenomenon, kind of like some geckos and lizards do, where the tail breaks off as a defense mechanism. It's called caudal autonomy or caudal dislocation. And if you're handling an earthworm and its tail breaks off, there's a good chance it's a jumping worm, because that's a trait that happens. And oh, it looks like we have a big here, so you can see a little bit. I don't think this one's going to jump. There it goes. And again, juveniles have this thrashing behavior as well. Let's keep moving. Well, earthworms have been moving through the upper Midwest since European colonists started colonizing the area back in the 16th century or so. This is the national distribution of jumping worms. Keep in mind that a whole state turns up as orange like this, even if they find one jumping worm in one county. So it gives a bit of a misleading idea here about just how widespread they are. For example, I don't think there's a lot of jumping worms in Key, but all of Michigan turned up red here because we have jumping worms in states. So these are the states that have jumping worms. It's certainly more than half the country in terms of area. And then more locally, where I live, where are they in Michigan and other parts of the Midwest? Their distribution tends to be patchy. It's not very well understood. We have some points where, usually citizen scientists have detected earthworms and then they plop them on different databases. I'll show you some of these in a bit. And then you have a record for that site. But they're a lot more widely distributed than this, for example, in Michigan. Their distribution tends to be associated with human activities and human settlements. You find these in the suburbs a lot. They're all around the Detroit area, all the suburbs of Detroit, Ferndale, Royal Oak, Madison Heights, lots and lots of earthworms in those areas. But their distribution is pretty patchy. There's still a lot of our nice habitats, our nicest forests that don't have jumping worms or European earthworms yet. And so I think it's important that we work hard to try to minimize the spread of these important invaders. But I think we also need some surveys across the state to better understand where their distribution is so that we can protect areas where they haven't invaded yet and be mindful of areas where they are infested so that we don't transport them from that area. So how do we prevent that? Well, one of the ways is if doing any sort of native plantings or landscaping around your house, I would really encourage you to use bare root stock. Earthworms do really well in potted plants like this. They can kick around for months and be very, very happy. Very, very happy. So if you go to your big box store and buy a plant like this, there's a chance that there's going to be earthworms contained within that soil. And if you don't want them on your property, I would take time to rinse those roots before I planted it. Then you can decontaminate the soil with a few different techniques. And I think we talk about these. In just a moment. So I really encourage you to use bare root stock in any sort of restoration activities and some good handling plants and soil practice, just some good hygiene sort of tips that I think you should be aware of. Know where your soil and plants came from and look for these signatures of these coffee ground shaped granules in the soil that are really indicative of earthworms in general. You can repot with clean potting soil. Like the potting soil you buy from your local big box store or hardware store is probably free of exotic earthworms. And that's a good way to go as something to plant your plants in. You can submerge the roots in water before transplanting them to dislodge any soil and any earthworms or their cocoons that are adhering to them. Keep your gardening tools clean. Store plants for sale on soil-free surfaces, such as a tarp or a concrete, trays, etc. I know Jane Giblin of Wild Ones in Southeast Michigan. She hosts a native plant sale every year, and she takes time. It's a lot of extra work for her, but she takes time to lift her plants off the ground and put them on boards that are propped up on cinder blocks so that earthworms that she has in her property don't make their way into these plants that she's selling. And I think that's a good thoughtful procedure that she's undertaking. Yeah, I think that's it. Some more best practices. If you recreate, with mountain biking or hiking, take time to take the soil off of your boots because you're probably hiking someplace beautiful and interesting, and you don't want to transport exotic species there. And similarly, firewood can be a great way for earthworms to get around. Especially if it's pretty decomposed, they like to get inside that wood. I've observed jumping worms, well inside of logs that I purchased for firewood. They actually eat some of that decomposed wood if it's a little bit. And a lot of people ask about vermicomposting because that's an important aspect of sustainable agriculture. And it gets tricky when you start talking about earthworms escaping the compost bin and entering our native forests and having some of these undesirable ecological impacts. But there is a species out there, Eisenia fetida. I advocate for the use of this as sort of an environmentally benign or a safe species. It's a tropical species, so it doesn't overwinter very well at higher latitudes, such as where I live in Michigan. These are called red wigglers. They tend to be relatively small, relatively thin. And what's distinctive about them is if you look closely, you can see these alternating yellow and red bands. These are really characteristic of this genus. And these guys are the best composters. These are the ones that you want for your composting bin, whether it be inside or out. Keep in mind that if you do buy Eisenia fetida or these red wigglers online, they're often contaminated with invasive species, including jumping worms. I did a project years ago where we just bought a bunch of red wigglers from different sources across the country to see what was being shipped around the landscape. And in most instances, it was more than half. They weren't selling red wigglers as they were advertised. They were often a different species because earthworm identification is tricky and people don't know the difference. Or they were red wigglers and they were contaminated with other exotic. So be mindful of that where you buy from. And I've been purchasing from and promoting Happy D Worm Ranch. There's the URL. They sell pure strains of Eisenia fetida. They do good work and they can get you composting worms in just a matter of days if you need them for composting in your house or out. More on best practices. Fishing is a common way that earthworms get around the landscape. Again, go to any corner store, any quickie mart in a rural area in the Midwest in the summer, and there is a 100% chance that they sell exotic invasive species. So what happens? You buy some to go fishing during the day. Maybe you don't use all the worms that are in your container, and perhaps your husband doesn't want them in the refrigerator. And so what do? Well, you just dump them out in the riparian zone. And this is a very common way for earthworms to be introduced into riparian zone. So be mindful of that. If you buy earthworms, just keep an eye on your bait and dispose of them responsibly. Dispose of your bait responsibly. The day. Well, if you do happen to find earthworms, there's a few different places you can report it. You can contact in Michigan your local SISMA coordinator. There's the MISIN, the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, where you can drop a pin and tell us where you found your earthworm. There's other apps that are useful. There's iNaturalist, iMap Invasives, and then there's a program in Minnesota called the Great Lakes Worm Watch. And then just become familiar with identifying earthworms and that telltale soil signature. Let's see how we're doing on time here. I think we're doing pretty good. So I think with that, I'm going to keep the slide up for just a moment, and then I'm going to turn off my screen here. But I did want to share my email address. Hit me up if you have any questions about earthworms. And thank you all for your time. And Rob, I think we've got time for questions. Should we have?
Yes, and we do have a bunch of them. So thank you so very much for the presentation. Very thought-provoking for folks. And so I'm going to start getting into some of these questions here. Let me just pull up. So we already talked about how to tell different species of worms apart. So that was a part of the earlier conversation. I may have missed this detail, but one person asked, when are the worms sexually mature and starting to spread new cocoons? At what time or age are they?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. For the jumping worms, that tends to be late in summer because they start off as a cocoon. They don't become sexually mature. I'm going to guess here a little bit. Maybe July is when I start seeing really well developed. I guess the plural of clitellum is probably clitella on the earthworms. So I'd say late July for the jumping worms, and then for a lot of the European species, they can reproduce year round. They reproduce when the muse moves them, and so they're a little less predictable.
Awesome, thank you. So one question here that I find interesting, do you know much about the role that these Asian jumping worms play in their native areas of Eastern Asia? And are there any types of control that happen there, or is it kind of just a natural part of the ecosystem?
Well, yeah, there it's a natural part of the ecosystem, and there's bacteria and viruses and diseases that keep these populations in check. But that's one of the predominant schools of thought about why invasive species, get introduced to a new setting and then take off and do so well. And it's called the enemy release hypothesis. This idea that when an invasive species is introduced into a new area, it has a real leg up on native species from that area because it doesn't have any enemies. Doesn't
Mm,
have predators that know how to feed on it, doesn't have diseases that it succumbs to. So I'm sure in Asia and elsewhere where these jumping worms are found, they have native predators that are very adept at feeding on them, diseases, et cetera, that keep them in check. Keep in mind too that there are no large-bodied detritivores in the Great Lakes region because of the glaciation that occurred at the end of the Pleistocene. And for that reason, there's not this real well-developed soil community with predators in it and things like that that would keep those populations in check.
hmm That's thank you so much for that, because that actually falls into another question that folks had. Just talking about what sort of natural controls are there, if any, for these worm species? Yeah, curious about that.
I wish I would have mentioned this, but once earthworms are introduced into an area, there's no known means of controlling them. We don't have a way to chemically treat the soil or biologically treat the soil, and this is why prevention is so important. Because once you got them, you're stuck with them for forever. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
People have talked about using these planarians, these little predatory flatworms from Asia, and introducing those locally. And we actually have those as an exotic species introduced in Michigan. But I find really abundant populations of jumping worms, and then I see these flatworms in the same area. So I don't think they're a very effective means of what we would say is top-down control on those earthworm populations.
Mm-hmm.
So the best thing you can do is don't get them because once you got them, you're stuck with
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah,
them.
I'm really intrigued too, kind of just on a personal note, because I know we talked about the changes in how the soil is composed based on the presence of these earthworms. And historically growing up, you showed like kind of the very basic diagram of how nutrients are cycled within an ecosystem or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if there are any benefits that we see, like unintended benefits from their presence, or is it primarily a negative impact that we see on our native ecosystems from the presence of these worms?
Well, I think when you have an invader, any kind of invasive plant or animal, there's going to be something that benefits from it. For example, we did some experiments with jumping worms, and raccoons kept getting into our apparatus and feeding on the earthworms. And they learned after a while, whenever they saw this little plywood enclosure, that there was probably 100 earthworms in there that they could get at. So, there certainly are winners, but man, compared to the ecological costs, I don't think there's any real benefits that I can think of that's worth having these earthworms in the
Right,
landscape. They are entirely bad news.
right,
You know?
right. Yeah, and so another really interesting question as it relates to fishing. So one person asked, and I don't know if you know much about kind of historical baiting techniques and all of that, but why are they still? Is it just a lack of regulation that results in that and worms still being sold? And I'm even curious. how fish even started to enjoy, eating worms that weren't previously there, so I'm interested in that aspect of it.
No, I mean, I've known about this forever, but it still blows my mind that you can just go anywhere and buy invasive earthworms. The same with the invasive plants. Some
Yeah.
of our worst invaders are great landscaping plants, and you can go to your corner box store and buy all these and just dump them in your landscape, and they don't stay there. They spread. And
Right.
the
Mm,
same is true of earthworms. We've just gotten used of using them as bait. In the southern United States, there's lots of native species, and perhaps people have been fishing with worms there longer, but
mhm,
they make good bait, and fishing is a popular activity. This is the main way that people recreate in the United States. It's the number one outdoor activity is fishing, and so the prospect of saying you can't fish with bait is not one. It's not an issue that I think most politicians would want to tackle as far
mhm,
as minimum spread because people like fishing so much. I can't remember what
right.
your question. I think it was somewhat related to
Yeah, no,
that.
absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to think um how much we've taken the presence of these worms for granted and how normal it
Yeah,
seems for them to be there. And I think there is a cultural shift that needs to happen in order for some of these things to be properly addressed. As you said, we'll be continuing to try to find management strategies, but up to this point, no known kind of control strategies. So even spreading or preventing the spread will require a kind of change in the understanding because I think in your kindergarten, ecology class or whatever you want to say, you're
yeah,
learning that earthworms are great because they churn up the soil, and so it's a very, very
yeah.
interesting and challenging. Um, so another question that somebody had, and this is related to the fact that really we all we can do is manage for the impacts of these worms because there isn't currently, promising ways to manage, their actual presence, but rather manage their impacts. What are ways that you can, I guess, address the impacts that the worms have on the soil once it's already occurred? Right? Are there ways to remediate the soil in ways that could make up for the presence of the worms?
I tend to see invaded areas suffer from a lot of invasive plants. Garlic mustard, buckthorn, autumn olive seem to do well after earthworms have invaded an area. So I think staying on top of those plants with the usual techniques of herbicides and pulling and prescribed burns. But I really don't. I mean, I think that's it. I mean, it might mean, if you're managing a property for native plants, you have to plant them more frequently because you're not getting very good germination rates. So I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
it really depends on, perhaps your goals of your particular project. But
Hmm.
I don't know of too many ways to offset the undesirable impacts of exotic invasive earthworms. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what makes them such a wicked problem.
Hmm.
You can't get
Right.
rid of them once you got them, and once you got them, there's nothing you can do about the impacts, as far as I know.
Right. Yeah, that's a real challenge, and I wonder, given the state of affairs now, and thinking about the research or the ways that folks in the field are approaching this, right? Do you see people focusing on trying to find control solutions for the populations, or do you see people trying to find solutions to the ecological impacts that they pose, knowing that those are kind of two different approaches to try to find solutions to the problem? I'm curious, not to try to manufacture a hopeful, side of things, but just knowing that it's a real challenge, and you as a member of the field, are you aware of any, promising research or even directions that people are taking for these impacts?
I think that the state of the science right now is just understanding the impacts that they have on native flora and fauna and understanding where they are. And the taxonomy is
Mm-hmm.
something that we're having trouble keeping up with because it's new invasive species all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Mm-hmm.
keeping up with that. But other than those flatworms that I mentioned, I don't know of any means of biological control for these earthworms.
Mm-hmm.
And this is particularly true given that we have, literally dozens of species at this point. Each of those might require a specific management action, which is
Mm-hmm.
difficult to imagine someone coming up with something that's effective for them.
Right.
So
Right.
I wish I could tell you that there's, exciting research on the horizon that's going to solve this problem, but that's just not the case. We got to
Right.
prevent them spreading into areas where they aren't found.
Yeah. No, and then practically speaking, I think you kind of answered this question, and folks are talking about it in the chat. But identification and understanding where these species exist is really, really important. So on the ground folks out there in the audience, if you are able to do monitoring to determine whether or not these species are in your area, or staying up to date with, mapping them where they occur, or acknowledging where areas where they're not currently occurring, and then really trying to do your best to support those prevention strategies, right? It's a responsible management of baiting and like education for the local public, all of those things. Like, it should be treated in a similar way to where you find an area where a prevalent invasive herbaceous plant species is not currently, and you're like, okay, we need to know that this is currently pristine to a degree,
Right.
and how do we prioritize those spaces? Maybe that is really the main thing that we could focus on now, is identification of where they currently exist, and then identification of where they don't, so that those places can be prioritized for prevention.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, Rob.
Yeah. And Doug, we will absolutely have access to the recording after this. Maybe just a few more questions. And I'm so sorry to the audience. We are getting a ton of questions. So thank you very much. I'm doing my best to batch them and trying to answer as many as we can, but really appreciate the enthusiasm in the chat, and also some good conversations happening between attendees in the chat. So that's really great. So something that I can't remember if you had addressed, Scott, is how easily and how quickly do earthworms generally move throughout the landscape? Is there kind of, do you have an understanding of that?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And so, just on their own, like how far, far will a population spread across the land, and in a year? Conventional wisdom is about 10 meters. So
Mm-hmm.
this is a number that you see in the literature quite a bit. But there's also human activities that can increase that orders of magnitude, right? Just one truckload full of soil can travel, obviously, hundreds of miles in a day. And so then you have these big jump events where the organism has been dispersed hundreds of miles in that instance. In streams and rivers too, and I think this is why we need to be particularly careful with what we do with our bait. Once earthworms enter streams and rivers, they can be dispersed a lot more than that 10 meters per year. Now you're talking about tens of kilometers per day. They do fine submerged in water. The cocoons survive submerged in water. So we need to be careful when we're in riparian zones and next to freshwater bodies, because once they enter that system, they can be transported very large distances in short.
Very interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm also seeing, so there's a lot of talk in the chat with some potential control mechanisms that folks have just had, personal experiences with.
Mm.
One of them, the most recent one I'm seeing. So in Vermont, the cocoons are only on the top roughly 2 inches of the soil in raised beds. They're removing 3 inches in the spring, solarizing it, and then turning over the remaining soil to prevent those cocoons from being viable. I'm not sure if you have any reaction to that, or just it does seem like there's a decent amount of probably just local interested individuals trying out solutions in their small areas with that they can maintain. It's going to be difficult to remove the top 2 inches of your entire lawn or an entire park or
Yeah.
whatever. But just curious if you have any reactions to that, or any other
Yeah.
control methods that you see in the chat.
I think, if you have a raised bed or something of that, really small scale, then perhaps you can get it managing abundances a little bit. But this person who's doing their best to keep those populations at bay, they're going to miss some of those cocoons, and the cocoons that survive and produce earthworms. Those earthworms now have very little competition, because this person has done the kindness of getting rid of all its competitors. So this is kind of the nasty problem as well, is that when you you can increase the survivorship of the individuals that remain from a management action, because you release them from competition with other earthworms. And so it becomes hard. So that person who's struggling with their raised bed, I'd say keep doing that. It's probably helping a little bit. But if you get scales beyond that, you start to encounter just the sheer impossibility of effectively getting rid of all those earthworms,
Right.
because they're hard to find, especially the cocoons.
Right. Right.
And again, you miss one and that's it.
Yeah. Right. Right. Well, I'm also wondering too, it's interesting, and I am sorry that I'm not able to scroll through the whole chat to look at all the different methods that folks had, but maybe we can find a way to share this chat as a part of the YouTube recording of this or something. But the other thing I'm thinking about is in terms of management. So if we are seeing, maybe we're able to confirm, or at least we have the hunch that it is harder to germinate and establish populations of native plants where earthworms are established. If you have a certain confined area where you are trying to establish a new planting of native species, maybe that's a way for you to at least help them get started in their early stages, manage that specific area for earthworms, knowing that eventually they will come in from all sides, and that's just how it's going to happen. But maybe there are ways to manage smaller plots of land in the short term. Again, I'm not trying to manufacture hope, but I'm intrigued by the thought of these small experiments that people are running in their gardens and other places. So that's really interesting. Well, gosh, Scott, thank you so much. It is absolutely, we are seeing tons of energy in the chat. It's really amazing. And I have lots of people sharing their appreciation for your presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, my
Conversation
pleasure.
ongoing. And definitely, if you are willing and able, in the recording, your contact information is there. If folks have, questions or whatever to follow up. So that's great.
Yeah.
And now I will just get on to some of our outro slides very quick. So allow me to share my screen here.
Yeah. Thanks again, Rob.
You are very welcome. Thank you. All right, folks. So we encourage you once again to become a regular at our Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. And so register for upcoming webcast. It's the second Wednesday of every month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. And we'll send you a morning of reminder by mail. Send that again, stewardshipnetwork.org/webcast. So a few that we have coming up. So what the wolves of Io Royal teach us about our relationship with nature, with John Vesitich and Rolf Peterson of Michigan Technological University. Then in February 2025, we have Plants and People, examining how indigenous knowledge systems help conserve native plant communities, with Tanisha Williams of University of Georgia Herbarium. And in March of 2025, we have Towards Sustainability, developing a comprehensive climate action plan, with Katie Carlisle and Jennifer Jaworski of Huron-Clinton Metro Parks. So once again, thank you all so much for being here today. We really, really appreciate you. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we hope that you will join us again next month. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.